Hello, dear listener. It is Marcus. Tonight, I have a very nostalgic journey for you. I will be reading Cinderella by Charles Perrault, followed by Snow White by the Brothers Grimm. Make yourself as comfortable as possible. Let your eyes close, and let's begin. The Tale of Cinderella. Once upon a time, there was a worthy man who married for his second wife the haughtiest, proudest woman that had ever been seen. She had two daughters who possessed their mother's temper and resembled her in everything. Her husband, on the other hand, had a young daughter who was of an exceptionally sweet and gentle nature. She got this from her mother, who had been the nicest person in the world. The wedding was no sooner over than the stepmother began to display her bad temper. She could not endure the excellent qualities of this young girl, for they made her own daughters appear more hateful than ever. She thrust upon her all the meanest tasks about the house. It was she who had to clean the plates and the stairs, and sweep out the rooms of the mistress of the house and her daughters. She slept on a wretched mattress in a garret at the top of the house, while the sisters had rooms with parquet flooring and beds of the most fashionable style, with mirrors in which they could see themselves from top to toe. The poor girl endured everything patiently, not daring to complain to her father. The latter would have scolded her because he was entirely ruled by his wife. When she had finished her work, she used to sit amongst the cinders in the corner of the chimney, and it was from this habit that she came to be commonly known as Cinderella. But her wretched clothes did not prevent Cinderella from being 100 times more beautiful than her sisters for all their resplendent garments. It happened that the king's son gave a ball, and he invited all persons of high degree. The two young ladies were invited amongst others, for they cut a considerable figure in the country. Not a little pleased were they, and the question of what clothes and what mode of dressing the hair would become, the best took up all their time, and all this meant fresh trouble for Cinderella, for it was she who went over her sisters' linen and ironed their ruffles. They could talk of nothing else but the fashions in clothes. For my part, said the elder, I shall wear my dress of red velvet, with the Honiton lace. I have only my everyday petticoat, said the younger, but to make up for it I shall wear my cloak with the golden flowers and my necklace of diamonds, which are not so bad. They sent for a good hairdresser to arrange their double-frilled caps and bought patches at the best shop. They summoned Cinderella and asked her advice, for she had good taste. Cinderella gave them the best possible suggestions, and even offered to dress their hair, to which they gladly agreed. While she was thus occupied, they said, Cinderella, would you not like to go to the ball? Ah, but you fine young ladies are laughing at me. It would be no place for me. That is very true. People would laugh to see a Cinderella in the ballroom. Anyone else but Cinderella would have done their hair amiss, but she was good-natured, and she finished them off to perfection. They were so excited in their glee that for nearly 2 days they ate nothing. They broke more than a dozen laces through drawing their stays tight in order to make their waists more slender, and they were perpetually in front of a mirror. At last, the happy day arrived. Away they went, Cinderella watching them as long as she could keep them in sight. When she could no longer see them, She began to cry. Her godmother found her in tears and asked what was troubling her. I should like, I should like. She was crying so bitterly that she could not finish the sentence. Said her godmother, who was a fairy, You would like to go to the ball, would you not? Ah, yes, said Cinderella, sighing. Well, well, said her godmother, promise to be a good girl, and I will arrange for you to go. She took Cinderella into her room and said, Go into the garden and bring me a pumpkin. Cinderella went at once and gathered the finest that she could find. This she brought to her godmother, wondering how a pumpkin could help in taking her to the ball. Her godmother scooped it out, and when only the rind was left, struck it with her wand. Instantly, the pumpkin was changed into a beautiful coach, gilded all over. Then she went and looked in the mouse trap, where she found 6 mice all alive. She told Cinderella to lift the door of the mouse trap a little, and as each mouse came out, she gave it a tap with her wand, whereupon it was transformed into a fine horse, so that here was a fine team of 6 dappled mouse-gray horses. But she was puzzled to know how to provide a coachman. I will go and see, said Cinderella, if there is not a rat in the rat trap. We could make a coachman of him. Quite right, said her godmother. Go and see. Cinderella brought in the rat trap, which contained 3 big rats. The fairy chose one specially on account of his elegant whiskers. As soon as she had touched him, he turned into a fat coachman with the finest mustachios that ever were seen. Now go into the garden and bring me the 6 lizards, which you will find behind the water butt. No sooner had they been brought than the godmother turned them into 6 lackeys, who at once climbed up behind the coach in their braided liveries, and hung on there as if they had never done anything else all their lives. Then said the fairy godmother, Well, there you have the means of going to the ball. Are you satisfied? Oh, yes, but am I to go like this in my ugly clothes? Her godmother merely touched her with her wand, and on the instant her clothes were changed into garments of gold and silver cloth, bedecked with jewels. After that, her godmother gave her a pair of glass slippers, the prettiest in the world. Thus altered, she entered the coach. Her godmother bade her not to stay beyond midnight, whatever happened, warning her that if she remained at the ball a moment longer, her coach would again become a pumpkin, her horses mice, and her lackeys lizards, while her old clothes would reappear upon her once more. She promised her godmother that she would not fail to leave the ball before midnight, and away she went, beside herself with delight. The king's son, when he was told of the arrival of a great princess whom nobody knew, went forth to receive her. He handed her down from the coach and led her into the hall where the company was assembled. At once there fell a great silence. The dancers stopped, the violins played no more, so rapt was the attention which everybody bestowed upon the superb beauty of the unknown guest. Everywhere could be heard in confused whispers, Oh, how beautiful she is! The king, old man as he was, could not take his eyes off her, and whispered to the queen that it was many a long day since he had seen anyone so beautiful and charming. All the ladies were eager to scrutinize her clothes and the dressing of her hair, being determined to copy them on the morrow, provided they could find materials so fine and tailors so clever. The king's son placed her in the seat of honor and at once begged the privilege of being her partner in a dance. Such was the grace with which she danced that the admiration of all was increased. A magnificent supper was served, but the young prince could eat nothing, so taken up was he with watching her. She went and sat beside her sisters and bestowed numberless attentions upon them. She made them share with her the oranges and lemons which the king had given her, greatly to their astonishment, for they did not recognize her. While they were talking, Cinderella heard the clock strike 11:15. She at once made a profound curtsy to the company and departed as quickly as she could. As soon as she was home again, she sought out her godmother, and having thanked her, declared that she wished to go upon the morrow once more to the ball, because the king's son had invited her. While she was busy telling her godmother all that had happened at the ball, her two sisters knocked at the door. Cinderella let them in. "What a long time you have been in coming," she declared, rubbing her eyes and stretching herself as if she had only just awakened. In real truth, she had not for a moment wished to sleep since they had left. "If you had been at the ball," said one of the sisters, "you would not be feeling weary. There came a most beautiful princess, the most beautiful that has ever been seen, and she bestowed numberless attentions upon us, and gave us her oranges and lemons." Cinderella was overjoyed. She asked them the name of the princess, but they replied that no one knew it, and that the king's son was so distressed that he would give anything in the world to know who she was. Cinderella smiled and said she must have been beautiful indeed. "Oh, how lucky you are! Could I not manage to see her? Oh, please, Javotte, lend me the yellow dress which you wear every day." "Indeed," said Javotte, "that is a fine idea. Lend my dress to a grubby Cinderella like you. You must think me mad." Cinderella had expected this refusal. She was in no way upset, for she would have been very greatly embarrassed had her sister been willing to lend the dress. The next day, the two sisters went to the ball, and so did Cinderella, even more splendidly attired than the first time. The king's son was always at her elbow and paid her endless compliments. The young girl enjoyed herself so much that she forgot her godmother's bidding completely, and when the first stroke of midnight fell upon her ears, she thought it was no more than 11:00. She rose and fled as nimbly as a fawn. The prince followed her, but could not catch her. She let fall one of her glass slippers, however, and this the prince picked up with tender care. When Cinderella reached home, she was out of breath. Without coach, without lackeys, and in her shabby clothes. Nothing remained of all her splendid clothes, save one of the little slippers, the fellow to the one which she had let fall. Inquiries were made of the palace doorkeepers as to whether they had seen a princess go out, but they declared they had seen no one leave, except a young girl, very ill-clad, who looked more like a peasant than a young lady. When her two sisters returned from the ball, Cinderella asked them if they had again enjoyed themselves, and if the beautiful lady had been there. They told her that she was present, but had fled away when midnight sounded, and in such haste that she had let fall one of her little glass slippers, the prettiest thing in the world. They added that the king's son, who picked it up, had done nothing but gaze at it for the rest of the ball. from which it was plain that he was deeply in love with its beautiful owner. They spoke the truth. A few days later, the king's son caused a proclamation to be made by trumpeters that he would take for wife the owner of the foot which the slipper would fit. They tried it first on the princesses, then on the duchesses, and the whole of the court, but in vain. Presently they brought it to the home of the two sisters, who did all they could to squeeze a foot into the slipper. This, however, they could not manage. Cinderella was looking on and recognized her slipper. "Let me see," she cried laughingly, "if it will not fit me." Her sisters burst out laughing and began to jibe at her, but the equerry who was trying on the slipper looked closely at Cinderella. Observing that she was very beautiful, he declared that the claim was quite a fair one, and that his orders were to try the slipper on every maiden. He bade Cinderella sit down, and on putting the slipper to her little foot, he perceived that the latter slid in without trouble and was molded to its shape like wax. Great was the astonishment of the two sisters at this, and greater still when Cinderella drew from her pocket the other little slipper. This she likewise drew on. At that very moment, her godmother appeared on the scene. She gave a tap with her wand to Cinderella's clothes and transformed them into a dress even more magnificent than her previous ones. The two sisters recognized her for the beautiful person whom they had seen at the ball, and threw themselves at her feet, begging her pardon for all the ill treatment she had suffered at their hands. Cinderella raised them, and declaring as she embraced them that she pardoned them with all her heart, bade them to love her well in future. She was taken to the palace of the young prince in all her new array. He found her more beautiful than ever, and was married to her a few days afterwards. Cinderella was as good as she was beautiful. She set aside apartments in the palace for her two sisters, and married them the very same day to two gentlemen of high rank about the court. The Tale of Snow White. It was the middle of winter, and the snowflakes were falling like feathers from the sky, and a queen sat at her window working, and her embroidery frame was of ebony. And as she worked, gazing at times out on the snow, she pricked her finger, and there fell from it 3 drops of blood on the snow. And when she saw how bright and red it looked, she said to herself, "Oh, that I had a child as white as snow, as red as blood, and as black as the wood of the embroidery frame." Not very long after she had a daughter, with a skin as white as snow, lips as red as blood, and hair as black as ebony, and she was named Snow White. And when she was born, the queen died. After a year had gone by, the king took another wife, a beautiful woman, but proud and overbearing, and she could not bear to be surpassed in beauty by anyone. She had a magic looking glass, and she used to stand before it and look in it and say, "Looking glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the looking glass would answer, "You are fairest of them all." And she was contented, for she knew that the looking glass spoke the truth. Now, Snow White was growing prettier and prettier, and when she was 7 years old, she was as beautiful as day, far more so than the queen herself. So one day, when the queen went to her mirror and said, "Looking glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" it answered, "Queen, you are full fair, 'tis true, but Snow White fairer is than you." This gave the queen a great shock, and she became yellow and green with envy, and from that hour her heart turned against Snow White, and she hated her. And envy and pride, like ill weeds, grew in her heart higher every day, until she had no peace day or night. At last she sent for a huntsman and said, "Take the child out into the woods, so that I may set eyes on her no more. You must put her to death, and bring me her heart for a token." The huntsman consented and led her away. But when he drew his cutlass to pierce Snow White's innocent heart, she began to weep and to say, "Oh, dear huntsman, do not take my life. I will go away into the wild wood and never come home again." And as she was so lovely, the huntsman had pity on her and said, "Away with you then, poor child," for he thought the wild animals would be sure to devour her, and it was as if a stone had been rolled away from his heart when he spared to put her to death. Just at that moment a young wild boar came running by, so he caught and killed it, and taking out its heart, he brought it to the queen for a token, and it was salted and cooked, and the wicked woman ate it up, thinking that there was an end of Snow White. Now, when the poor child found herself quite alone in the wild woods, she felt full of terror, even of the very leaves on the trees, and she did not know what to do for fright. Then she began to run over the sharp stones and through the thorn bushes, and the wild beasts after her, but they did her no harm. She ran as long as her feet would carry her, and when the evening drew near, she came to a little house, and she went inside to rest. Everything there was very small, but as pretty and clean as possible. There stood the little table ready laid, and covered with a white cloth, and 7 little plates, and 7 knives and forks, and drinking cups. By the wall stood 7 little beds, side by side, covered with clean white quilts. Snow White, being very hungry and thirsty, ate from each plate a little porridge and bread, and drank out of each little cup a drop of wine, so as not to finish up one portion alone. After that she felt so tired that she lay down on one of the beds, but it did not seem to suit her. One was too long, another too short, but at last the 7th was quite right, and so she lay down upon it, committed herself to heaven, and fell asleep. When it was quite dark, the masters of the house came home. They were 7 dwarfs, whose occupation was to dig underground among the mountains. When they had lighted their 7 candles, and it was quite light in the little house, they saw that someone must have been in, as everything was not in the same order in which they left it. The first said, "Who has been sitting in my little chair?" The second said, "Who has been eating from my little plate?" The third said, "Who has been taking my little loaf?" The fourth said, "Who has been tasting my porridge?" The fifth said, "Who has been using my little fork?" The sixth said, "Who has been cutting with my little knife?" The seventh said, "Who has been drinking from my little cup?" Then the first one, looking round, saw a hollow in his bed and cried, "Who has been lying on my bed?" And the others came running and cried, "Someone has been on our beds too." But when the 7th looked at his bed, he saw little Snow White lying there asleep. Then he told the others, who came running up, crying out in their astonishment, and holding up their 7 little candles to throw a light upon Snow White. "Oh goodness! Oh gracious!" cried they. "What beautiful child is this?" And were so full of joy to see her that they did not wake her, but let her sleep on. and the seventh dwarf slept with his comrades, an hour at a time with each, until the night had passed. When it was morning and Snow White awoke and saw the seven dwarfs, she was very frightened, but they seemed quite friendly and asked her what her name was, and she told them, and then they asked how she came to be in their house, and she related to them how her stepmother had wished her to be put to death, and how the huntsman had spared her life, and how she had run the whole day long, until at last she had found their little house. Then the dwarf said, "If you will keep our house for us, and cook, and wash, and make the beds, and sew, and knit, and keep everything tidy and clean, you may stay with us, and you shall lack nothing." "With all my heart," said Snow White, and so she stayed, and kept the house in good order. In the morning the dwarfs went to the mountain to dig for gold. In the evening they came home, and their supper had to be ready for them. All the day long the maiden was left alone, and the good little dwarfs warned her, saying, "Beware of your stepmother, she will soon know you are here. Let no one into the house." Now the queen, having eaten Snow White's heart, as she supposed, felt quite sure that now she was the first and fairest. And so she came to her mirror, and said, "Looking glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And the glass answered, "Queen, thou art of beauty rare, but Snow White, living in the glen, with the seven little men, is 1,000 times more fair." Then she was very angry, for the glass always spoke the truth, and she knew that the huntsman must have deceived her, and that Snow White must still be living. And she thought and thought how she could manage to make an end of her, for as long as she was not the fairest in the land, envy left her no rest. At last she thought of a plan. She painted her face and dressed herself like an old peddler woman, so that no one would have known her. In this disguise, she went across the 7 mountains until she came to the house of the 7 little dwarfs, and she knocked at the door and cried, "Fine wares to sell, fine wares to sell." Snow White peeped out of the window and cried, "Good day, good woman, what have you to sell?" "Good wares, fine wares," answered she, "laces of all colors." And she held up a piece that was woven of variegated silk. "I need not be afraid of letting in this good woman," thought Snow White, and she unbarred the door and bought the pretty lace. "What a figure you are, child," said the old woman. "Come and let me lace you properly for once." Snow White, suspecting nothing, stood up before her and let her lace her with the new lace. But the old woman laced so quick and tight that it took Snow White's breath away, and she fell down as dead. "Now you have done with being the fairest," said the old woman as she hastened away. Not long after that, towards evening, the 7 dwarfs came home and were terrified to see their dear Snow White lying on the ground, without life or motion. They raised her up, and when they saw how tightly she was laced, they cut the lace in 2. Then she began to draw breath, and little by little she returned to life. When the dwarfs heard what had happened, they said, "The old peddler woman was no other than the wicked queen. You must beware of letting anyone in when we are not here." And when the wicked woman got home, she went to her glass and said, "Looking glass against the wall, who is fairest of us all?" And it answered as before, "Queen, thou art of beauty rare, but Snow White, living in the glen, with the 7 little men, is 1,000 times more fair." When she heard that, she was so struck with surprise that all the blood left her heart, for she knew that Snow White must still be living. But now, said she, I will think of something that will be her ruin. And by witchcraft she made a poisoned comb. Then she dressed herself up to look like another different sort of old woman. So she went across the 7 mountains and came to the house of the 7 dwarfs and knocked at the door and cried, Good wares to sell, good wares to sell. Snow White looked out and said, Go away, I must not let anybody in. But you are not forbidden to look, said the old woman, taking out the poisoned comb and holding it up. It pleased the poor child so much that she was tempted to open the door. And when the bargain was made, the old woman said, Now for once your hair shall be properly combed. Poor Snow White, thinking no harm, let the old woman do as she would. But no sooner was the comb put in her hair than the poison began to work, and the poor girl fell down senseless. Now, you paragon of beauty, said the wicked woman, this is the end of you, and went off. By good luck it was now near evening, and the 7 little dwarfs came home. When they saw Snow White lying on the ground as dead, they thought directly that it was the stepmother's doing, and looked about, found the poisoned comb, and no sooner had they drawn it out of her hair than Snow White came to herself and related all that had passed. Then they warned her once more to be on her guard, and never again to let anyone in at the door. And the queen went home, and stood before the looking-glass, and said, Looking-glass against the wall, who is fairest of us all? And the looking-glass answered as before, Queen, thou art of beauty rare, but Snow White living in the glen with the 7 little men is 1,000 times more fair. When she heard the looking-glass speak thus, she trembled and shook with anger. Snow White shall die, cried she, though it should cost me my own life. And then she went to a secret, lonely chamber, where no one was likely to come, and there she made a poisonous apple. It was beautiful to look upon, being white with red cheeks, so that anyone who should see it must long for it. But whoever ate even a little bit of it must die. When the apple was ready, she painted her face and clothed herself like a peasant woman, and went across the 7 mountains to where the 7 dwarfs lived. And when she knocked at the door, Snow White put her head out of the window and said, I dare not let anybody in. The 7 dwarfs told me not. All right, answered the woman. I can easily get rid of my apples elsewhere. There I will give you one. No, answered Snow White. I dare not take anything. Are you afraid of poison? Said the woman. Look here, I will cut the apple in 2 pieces. You shall have the red side. I will have the white one. For the apple was so cunningly made that all the poison was in the rosy half of it. Snow White longed for the beautiful apple, and as she saw the peasant woman eating a piece of it, she could no longer refrain, but stretched out her hand and took the poisoned half. But no sooner had she taken a morsel of it into her mouth than she fell to the earth as dead. And the queen, casting on her a terrible glance, laughed aloud and cried, As white as snow, as red as blood, as black as ebony. This time, the dwarfs will not be able to bring you to life again. And when she went home and asked the looking-glass, Looking-glass against the wall, who is fairest of us all? At last it answered, You are the fairest now of all. Then her envious heart had peace, as much as an envious heart can have. The dwarfs, when they came home in the evening, found Snow White lying on the ground, and there came no breath out of her mouth, and she was dead. They lifted her up, sought if anything poisonous was to be found, cut her laces, combed her hair, washed her with water and wine. But all was of no avail. The poor child was dead, and remained dead. Then they laid her on a bier, and sat all 7 of them round it, and wept, and lamented 3 whole days. And then they would have buried her, but that she looked still as if she were living, with her beautiful blooming cheeks. So they said, "We cannot hide her away in the black ground." And they had made a coffin of clear glass, so as to be looked into from all sides, and they laid her in it, and wrote in golden letters upon it her name, and that she was a king's daughter. Then they set the coffin out upon the mountain, and one of them always remained by it to watch. And the birds came too, and mourned for Snow White, first an owl, then a raven, and lastly a dove. Now for a long while Snow White lay in the coffin, and never changed, but looked as if she were asleep, for she was still as white as snow, as red as blood, and her hair was as black as ebony. It happened, however, that one day a king's son rode through the wood and up to the dwarf's house, which was near it. He saw on the mountain the coffin, and beautiful Snow White within it, and he read what was written in golden letters upon it. Then he said to the dwarfs, "Let me have the coffin, and I will give you whatever you like to ask for it." But the dwarfs told him that they could not part with it for all the gold in the world. But he said, "I beseech you to give it me, for I cannot live without looking upon Snow White. If you consent, I will bring you to great honor, and care for you as if you were my brethren." When he so spoke, the good little dwarfs had pity upon him, and gave him the coffin. And the king's son called his servants, and bid them carry it away on their shoulders. Now it happened that as they were going along, they stumbled over a bush, and with a shaking the bit of poisoned apple flew out of her throat. It was not long before she opened her eyes, threw up the cover of the coffin, and sat up, alive and well. "Oh dear, where am I?" cried she. The king's son answered, full of joy, "You are near me," and relating all that had happened, he said, "I would rather have you than anything in the world. Come with me to my father's castle, and you shall be my bride." And Snow White was kind, and went with him, and their wedding was held with pomp and great splendor. But Snow White's wicked stepmother was also bidden to the feast, and when she had dressed herself in beautiful clothes, she went to her looking-glass and said, "Looking-glass upon the wall, who is fairest of us all?" The looking-glass answered, "O Queen, although you are of beauty rare, the young bride is 1,000 times more fair." Then she railed and cursed, and was beside herself with disappointment and anger. First she thought she would not go to the wedding, but then she felt she should have no peace until she went and saw the bride. And when she saw her, she knew her for Snow White, and could not stir from the place for anger and terror. For they had ready red-hot iron shoes, in which she had to dance until she fell down dead.